Today's project, probably quite a few days project, is creating this afghan designed by Premier for needle knitting on a loom. I want to make it clear this is not my pattern and I cannot give it to you. However, it is a free pattern on the Premier website. You can download a PDF, and you must do that in order to follow what I'm about to say. What I'm going to share with you is my notes as I work along on converting to loom knitting from needle knitting instructions. At no time will I picture any significant portion of the pattern because that would be a breach of copyright. But you will definitely be able to follow along with what I'm doing when you get your own free copy. And I will provide you with a link to Premier's website so you can find the pattern. This is an 80 peg loom. The pattern is for 78 pegs and part of it for 79 pegs. So all but 2 of the pegs are cast on in this picture. I'm working on a kiss loom because it is what I have that matches the gauge. Any loom configured more or less like this one would work. You really only need 79, but most looms come with even numbers of pegs as part of their setup. And you need 3/4 inch center to center spacing for the pegs. Cindwood has an 80 peg 3/4 inch loom. I think it would be ideal, and that is my first choice out of the ones I've found, just because they are stable and sturdy and so reliable. Apparently the Martha Stewart loom kit and the Knitting Board loom kit are configurable in the same manner. You should be able to get a good job done of this pattern using those options too. The pattern calls for basics super bulky yarn. It has a very good reputation and I'm sure I would enjoy it, but I'm using from my own stash, using 2 strands of Hirschner's worsted 8 yarn held together and treated as one. While gauge is not super important for a blanket, I'm pleased to see that using 2 strands of worsted 8, following the instructions on a loom that is meant to handle number 6 yarn, I am able to match the gauge in the pattern. It took 3 balls to make the entire blanket. First I ran 2 whole skeins together side by side, and then the third skein I divided in half, wound 1 ball out from the center, and used it as though it were 2 skeins. And here's the package information. The textures in the blanket are all created with a combination of knits and purls. The pattern is very clearly written, and the resulting blanket is just beautiful. It's reversible, not in the sense that the 2 sides are identical, but in the sense that it looks nice on both sides. The main thing to remember when translating from needle knitting to loom knitting is that we are always going to keep our work on the loom, knit one direction, and now we knit back the other direction. When we turn to knit back the other direction is when a needle knitter would have knitted all the stitches onto one needle from the first needle and now turn the work to knit back. We never turn our work, so every other row must be translated. Usually needle knitting patterns will be designated right side and wrong side rows. Ordinarily, I choose to use my left moving right rows as right side rows to align with the pattern. On this particular pattern, those will be the odd numbered rows. So if my row 1 instructions were to read this, I would follow it exactly. Now just suppose my row 2 instructions read the exact same way. I would not follow them. They need to be reversed. Everywhere that knits are called for needle knitters, we want purls, and everywhere that purls were called for needle knitters, we want knits. That's what I mean by reverse the instructions. We reverse the instructions because we did not reverse the knitting. So to make a needle knitting pattern work for looms, we rewrite the even numbered rows as I have rewritten the part in the green box. Knits and purls replace one another in the instructions. I'm casting on clockwise, skipping the last 2 pegs on the loom and using the double E-wrap. No specific cast on was specified that I saw, so I think I'll be satisfied with this, though I may go back and slip stitch or single crochet at the very end because I like that finish. I'm working in the direction that I am, so that row 1 will be from left to right and row 2 will be from right to left, and all even and odd rows will follow that pattern. That just works for me, keeping mentally organized. The pattern designates odd rows as right side rows. So my odd rows will be right side rows, and there we are, all cast on. The instructions say to knit row 1, and that's exactly what we'll do. I'm using the Kiss U-knit, which means you wrap around the peg and then the pin that's opposing the peg and go back and forth, and it automatically tensions your stitches. We've already talked about how to adjust the written instructions so they make sense for a loom, but I find it very helpful to make myself charts of what should be happening in any particular row, and here they are. These are the pattern repeats for each design in use. All of these are traditional Gansey stitches. All are just combinations of knits and purls. The green are knit stitches on my charts, and the blue are purls. These are not a substitute for the written instructions, because in addition to the pattern repeats, the instructions may tell you to knit a certain number of stitches, either knits or purls, before beginning a particular repeat. These are a way to help you visualize what stitch patterns need to be forming across the majority of the piece of knitting. And remember, this chart applies only to loom knitting, where we are not flipping our work over. It cannot be used for needle knitting. Let's take a look at the most basic chart, the one that represents the border stitch, which is used at the beginning and end of the piece of knitting, and also in between the other motifs. I'm working row 1 from left to right, so I start here and move in this direction. As I begin row 2, my working yarn is now over here, so I read and work going this direction. As row 3 begins, I'm back on the left and I work going right, and row 4 goes from right to left. Always read my chart in the direction you're working. This border design is a 4-row repeat, and you could do it any number of times for your own design. It's usually used twice in a row for 8 rows in this particular pattern. The other charts are scrolling past you right now, and they're all read in the same manner. You do not have to do any frantic screen grabs because these are all available for free on my website. One little thing to keep in mind, let's pause this. It would be logical, looking at this chart, to imagine that your written instructions would read knit 4, purl 1, knit 3, but they may not do that. That's because the pattern writer has to make an effort to make the instructions make sense at both the beginning and the end of the row. So depending on what else is happening at the beginning and end of the row, this row might also be described as purl 1, knit 7. As a way of making certain that you're getting the row aligned correctly with the rows above and below it, it's helpful to use the charts along with checking the written instructions and making sure the beginning and ending of your row occur as stated in the written instructions. Here I'm checking the gauge to make sure that I can get the same gauge on a traditional loom with 3/4 inch peg spacing. I'm working one of the purl rows of the border design. In order to enjoy making this pattern, you do have to be proficient at both knitting and purling. To purl, we place the new yarn below the original stitch, pull it up through the previous row of stitches, and place the new loop back on the loom. That's the same on both kinds of loom. Let me get quickly to the end of my purl row so that I can show you that I decided to end every purl row with a knit stitch. This is not part of the pattern. My reason for doing this is that I also decided to slip the first stitch of every row. I like the edge that produces. By purling the final stitch in the row, I would get a bumpy edge. If I knit the final stitch, I get this edge, which is much more to my taste. So even while working the garter stitch edge, I knit the final stitch. I used the U-stitch version of the knit stitch throughout. There I am slipping the first stitch, which means don't wrap it, don't knit it, and U-stitching the rest of the way around this row because this is a knit row. What I am showing you now is the traditional way of making a U-stitch on a traditional loom. Wrap the peg in a U shape with the yarn and knit over. It works well, but it's not the way I do it. I just leave the yarn supply loose and knit up and over and pull the working yarn hard enough towards the back, or in this case the center of the loom, that it causes the yarn to create the U-wrap on its own. Either way is totally fine and completely effective. Do what works for you. About the E-wrap stitch, I have not tried out the pattern stitches using E-wrap. It's not really my cup of tea. However, a lot of people do fine using E-wrap stitches combined with purl stitches. So I would encourage you to do something of the size that I'm working with now, maybe 20 stitches if you want to E-wrap, and do quite a few rows in pattern stitches and see if you like the effect. By the way, you could do a scarf using these same pattern stitches, except probably leave out the diamond brocade because its repeat is 8 stitches long and difficult to accommodate to a smaller peg count. That's 3 pegs on each end for garter stitch and 16 up the middle for pattern stitches. And it would be a good way to practice and see if you enjoy doing these pattern stitches enough to commit to a blanket. Here I'm demonstrating the U-stitch on both looms. Those pins that you see on the loom on the left, that's a kiss loom, they are just causing the U to form automatically by passing the yarn to and fro in front of the peg and behind the pin. So if this is not your kind of loom and it looks strange to you, don't worry about it. I'm just knitting and purling. The good news is that both the Kiss Dragon loom and the traditional loom, using 2 strands run together of worsted weight yarn, match the pattern gauge. Row 1 is complete. Now, row 2 also reads knit. If we were needle knitting, we'd now turn our work because we've moved all the stitches from one needle to another. Loom knitters never turn their work. So actually, we need to do the opposite of knit, which is purl, going back the other direction. Just as on any other loom, we reach through the existing stitch and pull the new loop of yarn up through it, remove the existing stitch from the peg, replace the new loop of yarn, and snug it up. I don't see anything about this in the pattern, but it's my decision to slip the first stitch of every row. I'm working row number 3 from left to right, slipping the first stitch, and then following the instructions just as written. The edges of this blanket are garter stitch. For us on looms, that's knit 1 row, purl the next row. It's the last 3 stitches on each edge. And when that is the case, I find it much simpler to think of them being all knit stitches when moving from left to right, and all purl stitches when moving from right to left. That keeps me from getting confused, and that's how I will think about it. I'm putting a direct link to this page on my website for you in the program notes, but if you wanted to reach it from the main homepage of the website, you would select Loom Knitting Information Index, then Gansey Stitches for Loom Knitters, and you would land on the same page. Here's a close look at the stitches involved. Garter stitch on both edges, border, double moss stitch, border again. Diagonal lines with a border area above and below it. Diamond brocade with a border below and above, moving on up to the beaded rib. And our final 2 patterns, arrows and moss stitch. In this pattern, we have to increase 1 time to accommodate the fact that the diamonds need a larger stitch repeat than all the others. It only requires 1 extra stitch, and I suggest you do it like this, even though you're about to see me do it differently. Move all 3 edge stitches, those involved in the garter stitched edge, out 1 peg, leaving this empty peg. Now lift a strand of yarn right there from the row below and fill the empty peg. What I did here was almost the same thing I just told you to do. It's just that I moved only 1 stitch out. Both methods count as full-fashioned increases. But here's what the edge looks like where I only moved out 1 stitch. It's not terrible, and I decided not to go back and do it differently because it was many rows later when I discovered that I thought it could look better done a little differently. When it was time to decrease again, I did move all 3 stitches over, and here's how that looks. So next blanket, I will move 3 stitches outward to create the increase and 3 back inward to create the decrease. If you enjoy deeply textured, bulky blankets, you might enjoy this one as well. This is my own design. It's a free video playlist to help you through it. I will put a link to the video playlist for you in the program notes.